So my first question for you is, what would you say about the the current state of the Republican Party? What state do you think she's in?
Well, I think it's really interesting. We had, and anybody who's familiar with my work, I tend to look at politics in the United States as moving between cycles in which one party or ideology tends to dominate, and the parties themselves, people will often criticize the American two-party system as being stagnant, that you only have one of the two parties in charge. But within the two parties, you do have an evolution of ideology that happens. What we saw with Trump in 2016 was the emergence of a new ideology rising to prominence, and I don't think it really reached a peak of power, or a level of power that was significant until the 2020 election. Unfortunately, however, Trump did not win that election, and we sort of saw the buildup of that throughout Biden's presidency, and now it's sort of come back to even more prominent strength than it would have had back then. And it's quite interesting seeing this development, and it's very promising for conservatives. But one thing that concerns me is there doesn't necessarily seem to be a very direct successor for Trumpism. There's the emergence of new Trump-esque politicians, but direct succession is the big thing. Somebody who is seen as like the ideological next step for Trump. A lot of people obviously look at VP JD Vance as a good choice, but there is a lot of debate as to where he stands on certain issues. He is making good strides in developing a presence for himself. But a lot of people do worry, is he America first enough? Is he somebody worthy of taking up the Trump mantle?
Yeah, so let's touch on JD Vance. So he obviously, rose to prominence after the release of his book Hillbilly Elegy, which I had the pleasure to read back in January, and it's an excellent book. I would definitely recommend it for anyone who would like to read it. And then he becomes senator in 2022, and now he's the vice president. So what are some things in which you would say, I don't know where JD Vance stands on this, or it's not clear, or has there been anything significant where you see he's gone back and forth on? Why is it not so clear that he's the heir apparent?
Well, I think it is pretty clear that he's the heir apparent. The question is more, is he a proper ideological successor to Trump?
Gotcha.
Yeah, reading Hillbilly Elegy, it's it really did strike a chord. I could relate to some of it. Even myself as a New Yorker, growing up in a very different background, but my folks were very poor. Different circumstances than JD, of course, but there were parts of that book that it's just like, I feel this. Like, I understand where you're coming from. Insofar as the difficulty is, it seems like it seems very much like JD Vance doesn't quite fit a proper mold, and that can be a little alarming for a lot of folks. Because what was it, a few years ago? And to be fair, this could be said about a lot of people in the Trump cabinet. He was very anti-Trump for the time, and that leaves people skeptical of like, okay, is this somebody who genuinely believes in what Trump stands for, or is this somebody who has jumped up on the bandwagon? There have been, of course, concerns about his varying position on, take for instance, foreign intervention. There have been historic discussions where he said he doesn't really see a future in which the United States doesn't have some presence in the Middle East, and this was relatively recent. I think 23 is when it was, 2023. And now it seems like he's shifted to a position of, we shouldn't be in there at all. Now, I understand people's ideology and positions can evolve over time, but we sort of need a clear idea of where does he actually stand. The big fear I imagine a lot of people have is that he seems too much like he blends into whatever is popular at the time, and that can easily be misunderstood as this guy might not have any solid beliefs. This guy might just be going with whatever is trending, which it's possible, or his ideology might just be evolving. Both are possible, but he does need to make it clear where he really stands.
So do you think that he's, clear running away? You think he's going to be the nominee in 28?
I think there's a very good chance. I think there's a
Yeah.
very good chance. Other contenders, potentially, you might say Marco Rubio, you might say Tucker Carlson. Other than that, it doesn't seem like there's too many other options.
Yeah. Well, I think about Tucker is I don't know how interested Tucker is in all that. I haven't heard his own public statements on whether he would run for president, but I don't know how interested he would be in that. Um, so yeah, if JD Vance is the nominee in 2028 and he becomes president, let's say he's facing. There's so many Democrats that are beatable in 2028. Gavin Newsom, for example, so he beats Newsom, he becomes president. Uh, where would you see the Republican Party going from that point on? Do you think it goes more in a Trump direction? Do you think it goes a different direction? What is I mean, like you said, JD Vance has kind of seemingly flip flopped a little bit. He seems a bit of like a chameleon, changing colors. Um, so it may be difficult to pin down exactly what a Vance administration would look like, exactly where a Vance led Republican Party would go. But do you have any idea where you think it might go?
Well, what I've come to the conclusion of, because I have thought about this a little bit, because Trump doesn't have a proper direct successor, whoever is the successor, and assuming it's JD Vance, it's going to be a mutation of Trumpism. It's going to be taking Trump-style policy and developing it a little bit in a different direction. I think he will double down on a lot of America First policy, but I think it's going to be coming from a very different direction from where Trump is. What I've found is that JD Vance's style of rhetoric and policy has a lot of appeal to Rust Belt voters, to a lot of suburban voters, to a lot of people who feel sort of like the forgotten majority of America. It's a little Nixon-esque in that way.
Yeah.
And I think that's all well and good. If he doubles down on that, I can see the United States moving in a more explicitly America First position where it's like, we don't really care so much for policy shaping in Europe, stabilization of the Middle East, even the pivot to Asia is sort of up in the air there. If the focus is very much on reasserting control and redeveloping what we have here in the United States, and retaking that from, say, China, who of course has taken a lot of our industry or is now beginning to buy up some of our land, reasserting control over what is ours, our businesses, our land, base, our financial opportunities. I can see that happening. Specifically, what that's going to look like is, that is difficult to say. But it's whoever JD runs against. The big thing is the Democrats don't really have a leader right now. And I have some friends who are liberal Democrats, some who are progressive Democrats. Nobody is excited about Newsom. None of them like Newsom. They say they would vote for him if he was the only one on the ticket, but the fact that you have so many people who say, look, if he's the one on the ticket, I'm not too happy about it, that tells me that there's going to be less turnout for whoever, if it is somebody like Newsom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you think that there is, and this is a bit, on a side note, but I'm interested to get your thoughts on it. Do you think there is a Democrat that you know of that you think can really excite the Democrat base in 2028 to get them out to vote?
Ooh, excite the bases. Yeah, that's an interesting one. Anybody who would be viable in 2028, I do not think so. What's very evident is that the Democratic Party is moving in a more progressive direction, and I don't believe it's going to be the progressive faction as we know it right now. Because one of the issues with the progressive faction at present is they still incorporate a lot of the wokeism, for lack of a better word. There's a big distinction to be made in the ideology of the Democrats. You have the liberals, and they are primarily the ones who will focus on the wokeism. They care about the LGBT stuff, they care about the DEI stuff, but the progressives care more about economic stuff. These are, what you could generally consider your more socialist Democrats as it is. And if you gave them the choice, you're like, universal health care or universal DEI across government institutions or whatever, they're going to take the health care every time. They care more about the economic outcomes in that circumstance. So getting somebody who appeals to both these bases is difficult because they're diverging significantly. And increasingly, the progressive wing of the party, which is the youth base of the party, the future of the party, they feel as though the old establishment of their party is betraying them. think to be in their mindset, think about how we were just a few years ago when the Republican establishment was considering dumping Trump after January 6th, and they're like, no, 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 he's not viable as a candidate anymore. We need somebody more moderate. We need to put Jeb Bush back on there or someone. It's like, no,
Good old Jeb.
we can't stray from that. And here's an advantage we have is the Democrats have shot themselves in the foot. Say what you will about him, but David Hogg he's a very intelligent operator, and he recognizes sort of the need to purge a lot of the old party establishment and replace them with a more radical activist new guard of Democrats. And of course, they got rid of him. So they have shot themselves in the foot that way, and this is going to delay their development, their ideological development as a party. Because, like it or not,
Right.
that progressive wing of the party is going to grow. That party is going to become the dominant wing of the party in time. But finding somebody who appeals to both them and the liberal wing of the party, it's incredibly difficult at this point. More than that, it's not just about rallying the Democrats together, it's about winning over some conservatives or Republicans as well. Because, the country isn't just 50-50 Republican Democrat, there's a lot of moderates in between who are going to be swayed based on whatever the policy or whoever the candidate is.
Mhm. Yeah, most certainly, most certainly. So, do you think that there is, because there's always a possibility, but do you think that there's a candidate on the Republican side? I know people have floated out other names other than Vance. Do you think that there's a candidate on the Republican side that could possibly take it from Vance in 2028?
If Tucker Carlson decides to run, I think he does have a good shot. Tucker's made a name for himself as being even more aggressively America first than a lot of the people, maybe not in the Trump cabinet, but he has voiced opposition. He has differed from what the mainstream is, and he argues for a more. He takes what Vance puts out there, and he just goes even further to the right with it. And I think that speaks to a lot of people. A lot of people will look at that and feel that it comes from a place of more authenticity. And he does also have the reach. Media personalities. We're in a period right now where your ability to reach audiences, your ability to have this level of exposure, it's very, very powerful. And Vance, he's made a name for himself as a politician, and part of his rise to popularity as well was being able to sort of collaborate with some of these podcasters, some of these more modern influencers, and get his name out there, get his face out there, show his personality as someone who's not just a stiff politician, but someone you can sort of have a conversation with. That's sort of how a lot of people have been describing it. Trump was able to do the same in the last few weeks leading up to the election, getting on the Joe Rogan show, getting on a few podcasts, and that really helped him to strike a chord with the American public. I think Tucker is able to do that same thing with a lot of conservative Americans, but much like the divide with the Democrats, Tucker might be a little too alienating for a segment of the Republican voter base, and JD Vance doesn't face that same issue. JD Vance is able to appeal to Trump's base, more hardcore MAGA guys, but also to a moderate voter who he might even be able to pull a lot of voters that Trump might have scared away with being as bombastic as he is. People might look at JD Vance and be like, yeah, this guy seems very easygoing. He's sort of the calming voice in the duo that is Trump and Vance.
Yeah, most certainly. And I just have to say, if Tucker Carlson ran for president, I mean, if it was him or Vance, I'd probably vote for Tucker, just because I think I trust Tucker to be more America first than I do JD Vance,
Right.
and that's for multiple reasons. But I'm completely fine with JD Vance as well. Um, so going into the more long-term future of the Republican Party, you mentioned this new ideology of Trumpism has really defeated the neoliberalism and neoconservatism, which had a hold on our politics for so long. Neoconservatism, really, since the Reagan era, neoliberalism, since around that point in time as well. How long do you see? Because you make a good point in mentioning that it goes in cycles. How long do you see uh, this ideology of Trumpism having a hold over the Republican Party, and what do you see coming next? Do you see a move further to the right, or do you see a return to more of the center?
So the fascinating thing here, it very much depends on what manifests during Trump's successor's administration, and that is a gray
Mhm,
area right now. If
mhm,
Trump had somebody who was ideologically very similar to him, say this is a good comparison I might make is sort of the situation between Jackson and Van Buren. You might think that Van Buren would have been a proper successor, but Van Buren wound up
mhm,
being ideologically very distinct. And you got a proper Jacksonian successor in the form of James K. Polk. James K. Polk took everything Jackson did and was arguably a truer adherent to Jacksonianism than Jackson himself was. If Trump is able to get that sort of James K. Polk out of J.D. Vance or whoever his successor is, then Trumpism is probably going to be around to stay for a good long while because delivering good results for the American public being reassured by those results. And the other big thing, too, is when you're in power like that, when you're able to sort of create a presence, the same way that a era shaper like Reagan was able to, like FDR was able to, like Roosevelt was able to inspire the youth to get involved in the style of politics, you can keep that going for a good long while. If Trump's successor crashes and burns, where it's in either way, if it's a matter of he's gone too far, like this is I was on board for Trumpism, but this is just not what I was on board for. If they go
mhm,
too moderate, where it's like, I wanted Trumpism, but this guy's just not doing it. And even if it's just like, well, this feels a little too alien for me. Like if this guy is, and this is also a risk that JD Vance might have with he's in tune with a lot of he's sort of maybe not hand in hand, but he has associations with a lot of these people in the more, what would be the right word for it, sort of the tech right segment of ideology, and that can be a little scary for some voters. And I think that's
yeah,
where Tucker really has the advantage, where he sees a lot of this tech innovation and he would approach it more cautiously than someone like JD Vance would. And I
mhm,
think the average conservative, they do lean more on the side of caution when it comes to that. So if Trump's successor crashes and burns or isn't able to live up to Trump's standard, then you're going to see Trumpism have a little, well, it's going to maintain control of the Republican Party for a while. But what's going to happen first is you're going to see sort of a loss of control at the federal level. And a lot
yeah,
of this also depends on whether or not the Democrats get their act together, which eventually they will. It's just a matter of can they do that in time, and will the circumstances be favorable for them to be able to retake power? In which case, if they do, there is an opportunity to sideline Trump's faction. What I've spoken about in some of my videos is the Democrats have a very strong opportunity if they are going in the direction of progressivism, which I'm very confident they are. They can do that and steal some of Trump's thunder. They can double down on the protectionism. They can double down on the border security. And people who I bring this up to say that sounds crazy, the Democrats being in favor of a strong border. Well, what I always say is you cannot be pro immigration and pro labor at the same time. The Democrats, the progressive wing of their party, if they do want to be the party of economic benefit for the American people, you're going to have to take a side. Will you choose to side with the American voters, the people who are going to put you in power, or illegal immigrants, people who have no loyalty to either party but are going to vote for whichever party makes things easier for them? You can take a gamble and go
right,
with those guys, or you can try to double down on that base, which I think is sort of an inevitability that can't really be escaped if they're smart about it. That's the whole thing. They have to exercise some common sense here.
right.
But it's the Democrats, so hey, who knows?
Yeah, well, they're not prone to doing that.
Yeah. If they withdraw from the wokeism as well, they don't have to
Mhm,
be anti-LGBT, but they have to dial it back because that's very alienating for a lot of people. If you're like a moderate, let's just say moderate conservative, right? And you might like some of the Democrats' economic policies, but they're pushing all this like trans ideology on your kids. You're not going to vote for that. If they dial that back, well, suddenly they're a little bit more palatable. So the Democrats, if they tone down sort of the social liberal stuff, which is, mind you, less important to a lot of the younger generation. Hone in on the economically progressive stuff. Steal some of the America First stuff from Trump, mainly, having a strong border. Non-intervention is another one as well. and this is also something you see among the youth. A lot of the youth don't care so much about the Ukraine conflict. They're not very fond of the conflict in Israel. You go to any of these protests where people are protesting, support for Ukraine, everybody's old. Like these are all
Hmm.
like 50, 60-year-old like hippie LARPers. That's they still think they're living way back when. But you ask the youth, and they're like, "I can't believe we just sent billions of dollars there when we don't have like free healthcare here." Like that's their argument. That's
Yeah.
their line of reasoning. And can you blame them? It's like they see the money going away. They feel what we feel, that we don't like seeing American dollars spent on a foreign country. So they have a strong opportunity to hone in on that. And if they do, and if the Republican candidate is unappealing enough, they can steal enough of that America First base. They may not be able to win Appalachia, which is, heavily, yes, labor politics are very important there, but conservative Christian politics are very important there as well. But they'd probably be able to sweep a lot of the Rust Belt states. They might even be able to, retake a lot of ground in Ohio. If
Hmm.
they're able to do that, and not even just the Rust Belt states, but you're also talking about resource-rich states, so Nevada, Arizona, Utah's actually a very fascinating one here because the Utah has historically, well, not historically, but in recent decades, it's been a strong Republican state. Um, the Mormons are not traditional Republican voters in the sense we think of. There are some policies the Democrats put forward that would be more in line with traditional Mormon values, but ultimately the Republican Party is seen as the Christian values party. If the Democrats tone down some of their more liberal rhetoric, they could even make some ground in Utah. I don't think they can flip it necessarily, but they could probably retake a lot of ground there. Maybe even make some congressional gains. So, yeah, if in the question at the very beginning was, how long will the Trumpism hold on to the Republican Party? Probably for a good long while. Will they maintain control of the country? That very much depends on Trump's successor. And if Trump's successor is successful, yeah, they'll be around for a good long while. I might say 2 decades.
Hmm. So, do you think, because there's been a lot of talk about the fact that Gen Z is moving to the right, at least the young men especially are. Young women, it's not as much, but specifically the young men are moving very quickly to the right. They're becoming more Christian. They're getting back into churches. Do you, one, I have a two-parter here for you, but one, do you see that continuing? And two, what effect do you think that'll have on the Republican Party?
So the trend of young men moving more toward the right, this is something I've always looked at very skeptically, because my question is, how do you define moving to the right? Is it just adherence to Christian values? In which case, it's like, how's church attendance? What are they? Are they converting and actually practicing, or are they just saying it because it's like a trendy thing? And that's an unfortunate thing I've seen a lot of. In a lot of Catholic circles, Orthodox circles, non-denominational circles, I've seen people, young men, I should say, who will, espouse their conversion, that this is what they believe in now, but they don't necessarily adhere to the actual values of the faith, and that's unfortunate
Mm,
to see. But is that a big chunk of what we're seeing, or is that just a small chunk of what we're seeing? That's a big question that needs to be analyzed. If it's not Christian values that people are weighing, how else do we define conservatism, or being right wing? Is it family values, which that can be caused by a lot of different circumstances? Mainly young men are, marriage rates are down. People are getting married at a later age. People are not buying homes. There is sort of a longing for that. There could be other factors at play there. Is it fiscal conservatism that they're talking about? Is it a sense that we need to secure the border? Whatever is contributing to that, we need to have specifics so we fully understand it. Because to say that young men are moving to the right across the spectrum of all those things, I have to look at that with some skepticism, because I want to know specifically in what ways they are.
hmm
I think it's a lot more multifaceted than we assume. So understanding that properly is going to give us a better picture of where things are moving. Insofar as rising religious adherence, I think I think there is sort of a little bit of a great awakening that's happening because young men feel this. They feel that there's something missing in their lives, and increasingly are
Mm.
turning to religion to to find that solution. Past generations, they would look toward hedonism. They would look toward just any type of fix. But
Right.
this generation, we see it everywhere. We see it everywhere, and we're like,
Mm.
that's not doing it for me. We've seen how the past generations are, and they don't seem very fulfilled either. So we're going to look elsewhere. And a
Mm.
lot of people are finding some solace in faith. But again, what concerns me is how many people will espouse faith, espouse conversion, but don't really adhere to it. And I can speak about that anecdotally. I've seen a lot of it myself, and the statistics are actually a little concerning as well. There was a test or a survey, I should say. I think it was a year or two ago, where they had a number of people participate to say, "All right, we're going to track you for a year to see how much you do attend church and measure that against how often you say you attend church." And the numbers were very, very discouraging, to say the least. So I think ultimately there is a move toward more Christian values, but the main thing is we also have to understand that in our generation there is a tendency toward trends, and the
Mhm.
fact is that as Christianity does become more popular, there are people who will jump on the bandwagon solely because it's popular, not because of a authentic belief.
Right.
Now, remind me, what was the second part of the question?
Second part of the question is if that trend does continue of young men moving right and becoming more religious, what effect do you think that'll have on the Republican Party? So, assuming that that trend is true.
Right. I think if these trends continue, the fascinating thing is I think you're going to see a deeper polarization of the party, because
Hmm.
you have to understand that religious divides in the United States, Christianity is not one singular thing.
Yeah.
You have Protestants, you have Catholics, Orthodox are there too, but they're a smaller subset of the population. It's mainly a divide
Hmm.
between what we could say is high churches and low churches. And increasingly, a lot of the low churches are moving in the direction of, well, not moving in the direction, but they maintain the old guard, old sort of establishment Republican tradition of, we just want small government. We don't really want the government to be activist. We don't want the government to do anything. And they sort
Right.
of, because that has historically been the dominant Republican, well, not Republican, but that's been the dominant conservative group in the United States, a lot of low church Protestants. But the high churches are also growing in number. Catholics are growing as a large percentage of the U.S. population. You're having an interesting number of people who are converting to Episcopalian and Anglican. Um, and there's a contrast between these two. The high churches are much more supportive of big government measures, of the government intervening in more direct intervention in what would be the term? Not law enforcement, but maintaining order.
Yeah.
Historically, if you had the type of measures that Trump's taking, some of these low churches will look at it and say Trump is moving toward more dictatorial tendencies. He's moving more toward martial law, whereas a lot of the high church conservatives are like, he's restoring order. There's chaos in our streets. This is very acceptable.
Mhm.
There's a light clashing right now, but if these trends continue, that clashing can increase. I think overall, those values there's enough overlap to keep us unified. But my concern would be if we become complacent and we allow the left to sort of pit us against each other, we're going to
Mhm.
have a major divide between what we might say is a more libertarian low church faction and a more authoritarian high church faction within the Republican Party.
Mm. Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. As a reformed man, my view on it, I would say I'm high church reformed. I know that reformed can be kind of a spectrum. It can be kind of a spectrum between high church and low church. Um, my view on Trump, for example, maybe invoking the Insurrection Act, using the National Guard to put down crime in cities, specifically Washington, D.C. My view on that is I'm completely supportive of that. And, you know, I'm a big fan of the founders. Federalist Papers are some of the greatest writings I believe that the United States has ever uh, that's ever been produced in the United States academia, ever been produced in terms of political philosophy in the world. And so I favor a kind of more strict originalism when it comes to the Constitution, really sticking to the letter. And I think people do rightfully say that this seems like it's drifting. We're drifting from the originalism that conservatives usually have towards the Constitution. But something I would say in response to that is that there was a letter that Robert E. Lee, and I'm going to mention Robert E. Lee because I'm a Southern man. I know you're a Yankee, but I'm from the South. I'm from North Carolina, born and raised, and so Robert E. Lee's a man that I would admire as a Southern statesman. Robert E. Lee said in a letter following the war, he wrote it to a general. I'm forgetting the name of the general that he wrote it to, but in it he says that patriotism sometimes requires you to do something today that you wouldn't have done yesterday, and you wouldn't do tomorrow. So my kind of view on Trump using executive power, executive force to stamp out the crime is, I wouldn't prefer it probably yesterday or tomorrow, but today in this climate and with the government the size that it is, he absolutely needs to use the power that's given to him at this moment to stamp out crime and insurrection in the streets. I wanted to transition to uh, more talk about the future of the United States and the future of American politics. So um, I want to ask you, with Gen Z beginning to gain political power, political influence more and more in the political scene, where do you see the United States, in light of that, where do you see the United States political scene being in 10, 20 years?
I think we're going to see a little bit more of a historic return to form for the US, and by that I mean more of an inward focus. To think about the level of influence the baby boomers had for as long as they did. So, some people think, well, why has it seemed like the Cold War never really ended? Why is the US still playing this role? A big part of that is the politics, but it's also the psychology. The biggest chunk of our population, these baby boomers, they grew up during the Cold War. It's all they know, it's all they understand. And as they sort of,
Hmm.
age out and you have these newer generations that have had to live in the aftermath of it, they have different desires. They don't long for that same type of lifestyle, and frankly, they don't really have access to that same level, that same type of lifestyle. They want to carve something else out for themselves, and that's going to manifest in sort of working with the real politics or the real nature of our situation as the United States, which is we are effectively an island. We have two neighbors that are not very powerful, but throughout the Cold War period, some problems have manifested. Of course, Mexico is very unstable. A lot of drugs come into the country from there. Canada, we
Hmm.
effectively protect them at little benefit to ourselves. So, taking advantage of the circumstances that we are gifted with as the U.S., we'll start doing a little bit more of that, and we've seen that with the massive support for Trump's rhetoric on stabilizing Mexico, on annexing Canada and Greenland. These things are just generally popular. And I think ahead of the United States, there might be some turbulence ahead for us because, of course, whenever you have a change or a transition like this, things are going to get a little hectic. But ultimately, I think we're going to come out of it a lot stronger as a country, as long as level heads prevail. There's always going to be people advocating for any number of extremes at any time. But as long as we keep the course and as long as we keep moving in the general direction that we are, I think we're going to be a lot better off and a lot stronger as a country, maybe even within this decade, if not within 2 decades.
Mm. Do you think that it's slightly rhetorical, but I'm also slightly serious. Do you think that the annexation of Canada will happen?
No, I don't think it's desirable either. Annexing the whole
Mm,
of Canada there's a lot of logistics. It's like, if we just took some, people think that because Canada's our neighbor and they're an English speaking country that they're sort of identical to us. They're not. They have a lot more in
mhm,
common with Britain, and Australia and New Zealand, the other Anglo countries. But if we were to annex the whole of Canada as it is, you'd effectively be doubling up something like California or a bunch of Oregons or a bunch of Washington states. It's not the best situation for us, as conservatives politically, for the government logistically. Um, it would be a lot to work with. I am, however, a big advocate for the idea of Greater Alaska. Canada does have territories that are sparsely occupied, just about the same population as the state of Wyoming. If we were to expand Alaska's border eastward and just take up those territories, that gives us access to the Arctic, which is going to be strategically very valuable to us. Trump has a lot of interest in that. For the resources there as well, not merely in the territories themselves, which are very rich in resources, mind you. That was their bread and butter for the longest time before Canada sort of shuttered a bunch of them. But you also have resource opportunity in the Arctic itself. There's the strategic importance, military strategic importance of, well, if you're up in the Arctic, you can intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles a lot faster than if you're down at our level. We do have Alaska. Right. Alaska is one tiny little sliver of the Arctic. If we expand our Arctic shield, we control that. On top of that is the strategic trade value of this. Trump has talked about reasserting control of the Panama Canal, controlling trade moving between the Pacific and the Atlantic. The Panama Canal is not the only pathway through. We do have the emergence of or I should say, the reemergence of the Northwest Passage. As the ice sheets have receded, people have been looking at the Northwest Passage as like, this could be a new Panama Canal. This could be a fantastic way to have trade between Asia and Europe. So the Europeans, the Europeans and the Chinese actually, once this passageway started opening up, were actually petitioning Canada saying, open this up, make it international, make it a free gateway for everyone to use. And even Canada was like, are you crazy? No, we're not going to give it up. But here's the thing. They can't do anything with it. China could patrol, if they develop the icebreakers, which they're aiming to do, they could go right through there and start shipping stuff over to Europe probably within 10 years. Canada does not have the means to do anything. They do have a large icebreaker fleet. A lot of those are retrofits and they're very out of date. I calculated about how much it would be worth to buy their whole fleet. It's less than the cost of building a new battleship. That's how old these things are. They're really out of date. And some of them aren't even true icebreakers. They have built some new DeWolf class patrol ships, but these are patrol ships. They cannot be long-term icebreakers, otherwise they're just going to fail. They're going to get stuck out there. Their main purpose is to just look around, make sure nothing is out of the ordinary, and then report back. Canada does not really have the capabilities to do much. We do, however. We have the military capability, we have the economic capability to build up an icebreaker fleet. Trump has expressed a major interest in, I think he said he wanted to develop a fleet of about 15 or maybe 20 of them, which would make us one of the top icebreaker fleets in the world. Right now, that position is held by Russia. China wants to catch up. So yeah, we sort of have the means to enforce our control over that. And if we did, we'd effectively have a monopoly on all trade going between the Atlantic and Pacific, which would enrich us as a country even more. Now, should we forcibly take that from Canada? No. But we're in a position where we defend them. They're our partner. We protect them. And, they can't really do anything with this. We recognize that if we leave this with them, they're going to get taken advantage of. They're going to be compromised. And them being compromised and taken advantage of, by extension, that harms us. So we need to work with the Canadians. We need to make them understand that, look, let us have this. We will reimburse you. We will give you whatever you need. But that territory, we can actually do something with it. And it's very urgent that we do before somebody else tries to take over it.
My next question is, so with the two political parties moving very much to the extreme either side, the right is moving further to the right, currently at this current moment. The left is, moving further to the left, becoming more progressive. If these trends do continue, let's say they continue. You can say, if you think they will continue or not. But if, say, they do continue, what do you see as the future? First of all, party relations and relations amongst just average people in the United States of America.
So this sort of goes back to the question of young men moving to the right. Uh,
Hmm.
there's a dynamic and there's sort of there's a variance to what this means exactly. The
Hmm.
parties moving to extremes, I think, is relative. They're moving to extremes relative to what we're used to,
Mm.
because both parties are, what they're used to the old neoconservative, neoliberal establishment. So they expect very small government, very pro-capitalist, very globalist, very interventionist. Both parties are moving away from this, far, far away from this. That doesn't necessarily mean they're moving toward extremes, but they are
Mm.
radical. That's important to take into consideration, and that's to be expected whenever you have an evolution of political ideology. Radicalism, it tends to go hand in hand with that. That doesn't necessarily mean it will last. That means that we are in a transitional period, and that's natural. We've seen this all throughout transitional periods in American history. When you had the move from federalism to Jeffersonianism, you saw radicalism on both sides. Federalists trying to secede, the Jeffersonians rioting and persecuting the Federalists. When the
Mm.
Jacksonians emerged, very much the same thing, but now they were antagonizing the Jeffersonians, who they saw as the opposition and the establishment. The only time it's led to, say, Civil War levels was, of course, during the actual Civil War. But the key difference there is you had a sectional crisis as well as a linchpin issue in slavery, where the North was able to moralize it intensely, and it was sort of tied to Southern power to a good degree. So that was very, very difficult to finagle. If you had a situation where, and that's the thing too, there is no real equivalence in the modern day, which sort of reassures me that we are, relatively speaking, just going through a normal transitional period and not
What do you
anything more
think?
radical.
Some would say the issue of abortion might be that issue. What would you say
That's
about it?
Yes, this is the interesting thing, because I've actually spoken to my buddy Franco about this, and what I find, and this is also a matter of the whole, what does right wing mean when it comes to pro-abortion and anti-abortion. What I find is that most people, when it comes to abortion extremes of like, yeah, you have if you're pro-choice, that means you can abort the baby whenever, even to like the last week. Most people
Mhm.
oppose that. What you find is most young people oppose that. But then when you have the extreme abortion measures, you find that swing around where people are like, yeah, most people don't support the extremes either. You do have a small segment on both sides, but what you generally find, what I've found in my research, is the majority of people um, are generally in favor of having moderation there, where it's like, look, there's some extreme circumstances, and this is even the position Trump had to take to try to win over some women voters, where it's like, look, in some extreme situations, we're going to tolerate it, and I understand that's a major moral issue for for us Christians, but politically, it's just where a lot of people tend to be right now.
Mm.
Um, but at the same time, you also have the radical side that's like, no, 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 absolute abortion at any time. They're very much more to the fringe of the popularity on that issue. So it's not as polarizing as the slavery issue was in the lead up to the Civil War,
Mhm.
um, but it is a major issue, and it's a little bit like, maybe I can't compare it to that either. I was going to say it's a little bit like the whole trans issue, but that is very much more of an 80-20 issue. It's, yeah, that isn't as prevalent. But the pro-choice, pro-life debate is a lot stronger, I would say, but not to the same degree as the slavery debate is.
Mm. Do you see an outcome where abortion is abolished? I'm thoroughly abolitionist when it comes to the issue of abortion. I want to see it abolished and removed entirely by, uh, preferably by constitutional amendment, the way that slavery was. Do you see a possibility where abortion is abolished? And or do you think that the country will come to moderate on the issue? See, because my particular thing is, I think that we've been kicking the proverbial can down the road for a long time, the same way that they did with the slavery issue, similarly. And I don't, you know, like you said, I don't know that it'll become as charged of an issue as slavery was. It could possibly, but it also could not. Um, but my view is that I don't think that compromise, does anything for anybody on an issue of such moral and ethical significance as abortion. You're going to have to take a stance one way or the other. You can't moderate. So either we codify abortion or we abolish abortion via constitutional amendment. So do you see a world? Do you see the possibility that abortion is abolished, and if so, why?
So there is a slim possibility there. It would have to be under similar circumstances to something like prohibition. It wouldn't be in, because of course, with the abolition of slavery, you're talking about requiring a full-on civil war essentially to happen. The slavery issue, what made it so polarizing was that it was directly tied to political power. Part of it was the expansion of slavery into new territories, and the South perceiving that as its ability to expand its influence and maintain a hold on government power. There's not the same issue with abortion where it is a power issue. It is just a moral issue at this point. Um, but it would be a lot more like the amendment which brought about prohibition. You would have to have somebody. You'd have to have sort of a tide of political fervor happen, sort of like the progressive era, where there was a sense of like, look, this is an injustice in our society, and it needs to be corrected immediately. So you would need strong congressional presence, and you would need an executive who would be able to sort of rally the public behind that issue. So I think it is possible. It would be difficult to do just because how opposed a large segment, well, not a large, but an important segment of the Democratic Party is. But it's not impossible. It is doable. The outcome I think we're going to see is sort of the outcome that Trump has laid the groundwork for, which is it is a state issue, state by state. Some states will abolish it and outlaw it entirely. Some states will unfortunately allow it. But I feel like with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and with sort of the giving it back to the states, for the majority of the public, this is, they've sort of come to accept this as the outcome that they're willing to live with.
Mhm. Do you see that mood changing at all?
I think it
Possibly
could.
in the future.
So this is
Yeah.
this is sort of what I was getting at with the idea of a sort of a moral and political fervor building up.
Hmm.
If you do have sort of an increased charging of the America First sentiment, along with a rise in conservative values, or I should say Christian values specifically,
Hmm.
I think you can certainly get to the point where Congress can get this through as an amendment and finalize it. But achieving that is going to be very, very difficult. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but there would have to be a lot of activism, and it would have to be done in the right way to be able to win over uh, a lot of these. And this is the big problem too. It's not even just a left-right issue. It is also unfortunately a male-female issue where a lot of these young women are unfortunately like very pro-abortion, and it's sort of the political divide between young men and young women, where a
Hmm.
lot of them are just unwilling to cede any ground on that, and it's hard to work with. But there has been some progress. You do have a lot of abortion abolition groups led by, I mean, primarily led by women. You see a lot of these, and they are making some inroads, but it is an uphill battle.
Hmm. How many, if an amendment abolishing abortion were to take place, how many years down the road do you see that happening? It would be quite a while, wouldn't it?
Um, so assuming that it is going to happen because of the political tide that Trump has set in motion, and again, assuming a lot more of Gen Z coming of age and coming to power, also probably within the scope of about a decade, maybe 15 years would be the key opportunity, because you don't want to lose the momentum of
Hmm.
overturning Roe v. Wade, but at the same time, that was enough of a victory where a lot of people feel sort of like satiated, like, okay, we got our win, we can relax now. You need
Right.
time to build the momentum back up so people feel like they're ready for another, another big mission, taking the next step in, having proper abolition for that through, something as big as an amendment.
Mhm. Right. Right. My last question for you is before I well, I have one more question after this, but my last question on this particular issue is uh, the future of the United States of America in general. Where do you see the American church going in the next, and what do you see as the future of American Christianity?
Yeah, so the United States. This is actually a topic I really enjoy. Sort of the nature of religion and how it influences culture and sort of nationhood in the U.S.
Mhm.
You have a little bit of, as I said before, you sort of have a little bit of a divergence that's going on with sort of this high church section of, well, that's more talking about the politics of it, because of course the high church is more tied to the political side of things. But within that, of course, you have the divides between, you know, Catholics, high church Protestants, low church Protestants, um, secular populations as well. And even with the secular populations, there is some religious influence in there. They've just sort of taken certain Christian values to the wrong conclusion, effectively. A lot
Mhm.
of these people who will, it's a lot of these it's a lot of these liberals who have never read the Bible, but they look at Christianity as like, oh, it's about equality and it's about just loving
Mhm.
each other, and it's, they sort of boil it down to its most simplistic thing. And that's of course because they might have been raised in that tradition, or their parents might have been raised in that tradition, and they instilled those values down to them, but they were so watered down that the conclusions they came away with were very liberal. um, so what I see with with American religion moving forward is it's sort of a continuation of what has been going on, where you have different denominations or different branches sort of remaining prominent in different areas. I think Catholicism is rising to be a much more prominent force in American politics. And that does go hand in hand sort of with the rise in the Hispanic American population as well. But you also see a lot more people converting to the faith. The evolving of Protestantism, or low church Protestantism, I should say specifically, is also quite fascinating, because increasingly I see a lot of people moving away from the Baptist faith, which is sort of the dominant, I guess we could say the dominant denomination in Protestantism in the United States,
Mhm.
and increasingly moving toward non-denominationalism, which is sensible because ultimately the Baptist faith believes in not having any proper church hierarchy or structure, but the Southern Baptist Convention is effectively that. So a lot of people feel like, look, I don't feel that this is the way we're supposed to be practicing our faith. So they move more toward the non-denominational, more congregationalist direction, and I think that's going to take off with a lot more prominence in several parts of the South, perhaps in Appalachia as well. And I think that's, I mean, heck, Trump has moved toward identifying as non denominational, though I think that's for different reasons. I feel that he's sort of disillusioned with mainstream Protestantism. I mean,
Mhm.
you saw how he interacted and how he reacted to the Episcopal Church, I believe it was, where there was that, yeah, yeah, that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I see the non-denominationals probably in the next few years. Maybe actually no, that's a little too soon. Probably in the next half century, the non-denominationals will be a major, if not one of the leading, um, low church Protestant groups in the U.S. Uh, and insofar as what's going on with, and this is something that Redeemed Zoomer has spoken about, sort of the retaking of the mainline churches in Protestantism is sort of another interesting emergence that we're seeing. That's also an uphill battle, but it's certainly one worth doing. You have a lot of people who are sort of uh, rediscovering these values that are not, they're not in the same vein as the more spiritual evangelical interpretation of Protestantism. Um, but it's also like pushing back against what's become sort of the what's a good way, sort of the wokeism that has penetrated a lot of
Mhm.
these churches, and it's just very common in like Methodism, and it's common in the Episcopal Church. With I think you will start to see a little bit more of a struggle to retake those mainline churches. I think that's going to become a lot more mainstream. But you also have to understand that the faction that's holding on to those is also going to be a little combative. And I don't
Mhm.
see the left, or sort of the more liberal faction of America trying to hold on to those necessarily. The people who were, because the people who were there and who embraced a lot of those ideals, most of them have moved on to just outright secularism. But
Right.
those who are still lingering and holding on, I think they're going to be putting up a little bit of a fight, and you're going to see a little bit of a culture war within more mainline Protestant denominations.
Mm. And if the mainline Protestant churches are retaken, what effect do you think that'll have on the American political scene? Do you think
It'll
there will be like a third, a big um, section of the American political space that's the mainline Protestant space?
it's going to be interesting to think about, because one of the big things that it's sort of how can I phrase this? There has been such a hold on American faith by the evangelicals since at least the 50s or so. So seeing the mainliners they take back their churches would make them competitive within the Protestant space. But again, the question is sort of going to be, how big is that share of uh,
Mm.
total American the total American faith as a whole? I think you'll see some of these churches probably align more with the Catholics and the Orthodox and a lot of the high churchers. And again, this goes back to what I was talking about before, where if there is division within the Republican Party, it's primarily going to be between the high churches and the low churches. You'll see a lot of those mainliners probably faction themselves more on the high church side, as they
Mm.
see, look, we
That's right.
need order. Order is the key
Mm.
thing. It is sort of a struggle between freedom, which I think is represented more in the low church faction, and actually restoring order, whether it's order of faith, whether it's the order of our country as a whole, the order of our society, having things better structured and be able to provide for us. Because I think our generation has we've almost had a bad taste in our mouth from excessive, and this is also going to sound strange, but excessive liberty, not in the sense of, say, the type of freedom that we think of when we talk about like gun rights, when we talk about free speech. Liberty in the sense of the liberal libertine lifestyle of do whatever you want. We feel like an excess of that, we see the slippery slope it creates, and we're afraid of that. We are
Mhm.
willing to embrace a more structured, more regimented lifestyle and order of society if it means that the quality of life improves and we have a more stable future to offer to future generations.
Mm. That's good. That's good. My last question for you before we wrap up is concerning Mr. Curtis Sliwa. So why, just why should New Yorkers go with Mr. Sliwa rather than, say, because I've seen so many people comment on his post and say, "Sir, drop out of the race, endorse Cuomo. You're gonna cause," and they're like, they're already blaming him for Mamdani being elected. Practically, just ringing the bell of defeat before it's over with. Why should people throw their vote behind him rather than Cuomo in an effort to
Oh,
defeat Mamdani?
well, I'd say it'd be foolishness to vote for anyone but Sliwa. Sliwa is the Republican candidate, and people have been treating him like a third party candidate, mostly because of
Mhm.
the polls. A lot of people have been saying, "Oh, well, look, he's polling so low. There's no way he can win." People forget that Cuomo is a Democrat. Cuomo is running on an independent ticket. Yes, he has name recognition as the former governor, but he was a very unpopular governor. So
Mhm.
I say I don't trust the polls. The polls even had Cuomo beating Mamdani, and we all know how that went. He lost by about
Mhm.
13 points. Now, I've crunched the numbers and I've looked at, you know, all factors at play, and Curtis Lewa has a chance. I'm not saying it's a shoo-in for him, but he has a chance, and that's a lot more than most people have been saying. Some factors to take into consideration, and I'll talk about Sliwa's character as well, just real quick. This is somebody who has actually fought for common New Yorkers. He has been on the streets with his guardian angels, protecting us when the cops weren't doing the job, when the streets were chaotic. He's been in this business for a long time. Curtis, and this is something I feel that a lot of New Yorkers feel, a lot of legacy New Yorkers feel. Curtis represents us. Curtis, the way he speaks, the things he talks about, his experiences, just his day-to-day life, that's how we live. That it speaks to a type of like New York nationalism only we really understand. A lot of the people I find that are backing Cuomo or backing, that are backing Cuomo or before that backing Eric Adams, these are people who have had it well off. Maybe they're from Long Island, and they moved to the city. Maybe these are people who moved from some other red part of the state or maybe upstate to the city, and they think they understand New York politics the same way we do. I grew up very poor in Brooklyn. It's like I wasn't in the worst neighborhood. There were worse neighborhoods than where I was, but it was rough, and my upbringing, that it exposed me to certain experiences, and that made me sort of feel what it was like to be in the big city without sort of the shelteredness of, living in a fancy townhouse on the good side of town, of having the promise of a good college education, of having a good job lined up. And when Curtis talks about the experiences of living in New York, I feel that. Everything he speaks to resonates with me. And when I talk to people I know, when I talk to other people who have spent their entire lives growing up and had experiences and had lifestyles similar to mine, they feel the same. They feel that Curtis is a real voice for who we are, for the real New Yorkers. And I'd say probably for Brooklyn, more than Brooklyn and Staten Island more than anyone anywhere else. A lot of the people who are pro Adams and now pro Cuomo, they're Manhattan folks. They've got nice jobs and they went to the fancy colleges and they've got the vacation homes and the backup places they can run to if something bad happens in the city. The rest of us, no, we've been in the city through the good times and bad, and we're going to stick around through the good times and bad. I've told people it's like whoever wins this election, I'll be in New York in 2026 and in the years moving forward. Like I've been out of state for some business stuff, but I'm going to be permanently settled back in Brooklyn. I've been going back and forth is essentially what's been going on, but whoever wins, I'm going to be permanently in Brooklyn. That's home. That's one thing I've learned from being away for a while is I only have one home, like nowhere else feels the same way as Brooklyn does. And I'm willing to be there and be on the front lines because honestly, where else am I going to go? But that's enough about, sort of the persona of Sliwa, but the numbers as well. So when you look at what's going on with the election, people are treating it as though Sliwa is the third party candidate. What they don't recognize, this is the most frustrating thing, the Democratic Party is split. Progressives and liberals are split. And yet we in the Republican Party are acting like we're the ones who are split. And we need to choose between, not even that. We are actively trying to split ourselves. And it's ridiculous. If we all rally behind Sliwa, we'll win. If we split our vote because we want to be cautious, so we're splitting our own vote. We have done to ourselves what the Democrats have already done to themselves, that we don't have to be in that situation. So you have to consider that factor. You have the interesting fact that you had a massive swing in New York City specifically of Hispanics toward Trump in 2024. Now, understand that Sliwa is not Trump. And you might think that's a disadvantage, but no, it's an advantage because, of course, Trump is not as popular among a lot of New Yorkers as some people, as he would be in more red parts of the country. Sliwa, if he pulled if he pulled the same Hispanic swing in this election that Trump did, that puts him about 5-6 points higher than most people assume. And if we assume that the turnout's even higher, because understand that Sliwa, when he is going around, he goes to the rougher neighborhoods. He goes to areas that are, that are rocked by the crime and a lot of the migrant crime. And a lot of this is also like Hispanic communities, because where do the migrants go when they arrive here? They go to the Hispanic communities where people speak their language, and they're bringing crime there. And a lot of the people who have been set up here, who have come here legally, and who do have businesses, who have lives, who have children, they don't like that, and they want somebody who is going to stand up and fight for them. Which is why I think that Sliwa is probably going to perform a lot better with the Hispanics than he did back in 2021. 2021, I think I have that right. Yeah, 2021. Then there's, of course, the matter of, well, how polarizing Mamdani is. Mamdani is, and I guess there's a couple factors to take into consideration here, and I'm sort of like going off the top of my head here.
Mhm.
There is the black vote, there's the Jewish vote, there's also sort of the general liberal vote. If you look at the breakdown of this stuff, I had a whole chart where I broke this down. Mamdani's ceiling is not as high as it would appear to be. His what he got in the primary is good, because you're talking about primarily the Democratic section of the party, but there's also the moderates that have to be taken into consideration here. And when you factor all that in, the only way, well, I shouldn't say the only way, but Cuomo's potential is not as high as people think it is, and it will only be, it'll only be higher if you have this huge surge of Republicans to him. But the simple fact is, a lot of Republicans don't want to. A lot of the common New Yorkers aren't going to be shaken on this, because we remember what his governorship was like. He doesn't have that going for him. Sliwa is, yeah, you might say that he's a Republican in a sea of blue, but there are a lot of Republicans here. The Democrats are basically broken as a faction. They're going two different ways. There's no reason for us to break our own vote. If we can mobilize behind Sliwa, if Sliwa is able to pull enough of the Hispanic vote, if Sliwa was able to pull enough of the Jewish vote, which a lot of them obviously are not going to be going for Mamdani. And the interesting thing here as well is, and I don't mean to drag this on, there's just a lot of factors at play here.
You're good. This is great.
But yeah, the Jewish vote as well is sort of split, because you have to take into consideration the religious Jewish vote and the secular Jewish vote. Traditionally, the secular Jewish vote would go for somebody like, whoever the Democratic candidate is. But with somebody like Mamdani, they do back him, but not in the same majorities that they would other candidates. So you have that little breakaway faction. Now that faction could go to somebody like Cuomo, but Sliwa, trying to make his inroads, and he has done so in the past, and he has been trying to do that this election. He has the potential to steal that vote away as well. You have to take into consideration the black vote is also going to be split, because you had Cuomo has connections to all the political machines in a lot of the dominantly black neighborhoods, so he does have a little bit of hold on that. But you also have a little bit of a split between Cuomo and Adams. Now, Adams is out of the race, but his name is still going to appear on the ballot. And that is going to be significant, because you will still have people who, some people don't follow all the news. Some people might be like, yeah, I'll vote Adams. And some of these would be, these guys otherwise would have been Cuomo voters. So that waters down his vote significantly as well. Well, I mean, maybe not significantly, but just, a few points. 2 points, 3 points, that is going to be significant in a race where you have, 30-30-30 just about. So ultimately, I think Sliwa has a lot more of a chance than people are giving him credit for. What I think Sliwa would really need to put him over the top is like an endorsement from Trump. And that's hard, because, Sliwa and Trump have a little bit of a history, but it would really benefit him if he was able to have the head of the Republican Party effectively be like, look, he's the Republican candidate, don't vote Cuomo. Don't vote for the Democrat. Vote for the actual Republican. If he had that, I'd be very confident that he'd be able to consolidate everyone behind him. It's just a very frustrating situation. He has a shot. I don't think it's a guaranteed shot, but even then, let me not even talk about that. Let's talk about the circumstances. What's really at risk here? If my computer is about to die, I'll try to wrap this up, and then hopefully my computer doesn't die.
Yeah.
But vote for Sliwa, and what happens? If he wins, you get a Republican mayor, someone who's an actual Republican. If he doesn't win, you vote for Sliwa and he doesn't win, then Mamdani becomes mayor. But what happens? Trump has made it very clear that if Mamdani wins, he's going to do everything in his power, to not let him ruin New York. Whether it's send federal troops to the city to enforce order, whether it's trying to hinder him, whether it's like, hey, you might be guilty of what was that story? The story of like allegedly money laundering or something like that. He had foreign money or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Trump has ammunition against Mamdani if he wins. So I'm not as worried about that. But what if Cuomo wins? If Cuomo wins, you have a Democrat in power, but a Democrat who doesn't raise any eyebrows. You have people feeling like, oh yeah, all right, crisis averted. No, the bleed's going to continue. Bad policy is going to continue to happen, and nobody's going to wake up to it. What happens 4 years later? You have another mayoral election. This time, there's no Curtis Sliwa. There's no good Republican candidate. And you have Mamdani himself come back, or you have somebody who's even more radical crop up. And there's no more Trump around to, enforce the same policy to protect the city. Then what? Then it's game over, basically. Cuomo is probably the worst possible outcome for the city.
Mm-hmm.
Mamdani is checkable. There's something that we can do about that. Sliwa is just an outright win. Cuomo is status quo, continued bleed, continued rot, and everything just sort of goes downhill slowly.
Yeah, most certainly. Well, thank you so much for coming on, man. I appreciated having you on.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. We'll have to have you on back again, most certainly.
Certainly, man.
You've been listening to Isaiah Lafone, Unapologetic. Thank you so much for listening to us today. If you would like to support my ministry and work, you can do so by going to my website, which will be linked in the description. That'll be isaiahlafone.com, and you can go to the donate section and give there. If you cannot give monetarily, please make sure to continue to pray for me and do the normal things like liking this video, subscribing, and sharing if you found it helpful, as it really helps out the channel. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your support. God bless you, and may the peace of Christ go with you.